My name is Dave Emory, and it's my privilege to introduce to this audience John Loftus, a former career military officer and Justice Department investigator, and along with Mark Ahrens, the co-author of a remarkable new book called The Secret War Against the Jews, subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People. The Secret War Against the Jews was published by the St. Martin's Press in hardcover and copyrighted 1994. John, welcome to our airwaves.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Dave.
Before we actually delve into the substance of your book, John, I think it might be useful for the benefit of the audience to give a little bit of background information about how you came to be investigating the material that you investigated in the Secret War Against the Jews. I know I have been following your professional career since an appearance on 60 Minutes and the publication of your 1982 book, The Belarus Secret.
Yeah. Well, it started back in 1977 when I started work for the Attorney General of the United States. And under the Carter and then the Reagan administrations, I was part of the Office of Special Investigations, the Nazi War Crimes Unit. And my job was to work with the intelligence agencies to see if I could find any leads where there were Nazis hiding in America. Well, what I found out instead was that many of the Nazis I'd been assigned to prosecute were already on the government payroll. I got permission from the CIA to go public, and I appeared on 60 Minutes in 82 and then wrote my first book about it. Then I wrote another book about Nazis called Unholy, Trinity, involved in the Vatican connection. Well, I had done 2 books on Nazis, and a lot of people in the intelligence community had sort of come to trust me and speak to me in confidence. And they said, if you think what we did with the Nazis was bad, let us tell you what we did to the Jews. And then I knew I was going to have to pretty much take some time away permanently from my legal practice and finish a very, very long research project. So after some 12 years and more than 500 interviews with former intelligence agents, my co-author and I have put together what we hope is a definitive history of all the covert operations and dirty tricks we pulled on the Jews and on Israel in the 20th century.
It might be interesting, John, to, in a sense, begin with the ending of your book. As we are recording this on June 2nd, 1995, the world's attention has been fixed in recent weeks on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, the end of World War II in Europe. During the course of your investigations with the Office of Special Investigations, you came across an element in the United States called the Vorkommando Moscow. Could you tell us just a little bit about what that unit was?
Sure. It was one of many Nazi intelligence units that operated on the Eastern Front. The Vorkommando Moscow was a unit of the elite SS intelligence that recruited local volunteers from the fascist groups of Eastern Europe, primarily from White Russia, the Ukraine, and the Baltic states. And these people, at the end of World War II, went underground and then were recruited by the British Secret Service. The British said, well, look, the Germans are defeated now, the Russians are the new enemy, and who better to help us prepare for World War III than these very people from Eastern Europe who recently fought with the Nazis. These people aren't really Nazis, they're just nationalists. They're really freedom fighters. Well, it sounded like a good line, but the only problem with the freedom fighter program was that the guy in charge of it in Britain was Kim Philby. And Kim Philby was the highest-ranking communist agent inside the British Secret Service. And the people he was sending us weren't freedom fighters. They were actually the dregs of the Nazi war criminals, many of whom could be easily blackmailed into working for the Soviets. It's one of the reasons we suffered so many casualties in the Cold War.
The average American in 1995 would perhaps find the notion that U.S. intelligence would respond with enthusiasm to the British intelligence suggestion that we employ Third Reich collaborators as agents and actual foot soldiers against the former Soviet Union during the Cold War.
But to be fair, U.S. intelligence didn't. The CIA was out hunting Nazis, the Army was out hunting Nazis, President Truman had given strict orders about it, Congress had passed laws. What happened is that a tiny group of officials in our State Department intelligence service committed mutiny. They figured that President Dewey would be in office very soon and Truman would be defeated.
Mm-hmm.
And behind the president's back, and without any authorization, they were helping the British Secret Service relocate these so-called freedom fighters to America.
We're going to be... I wanted to get into that in more detail after filling in some of the background to the politics of the Dewey-Truman 1948 election. But I think for the benefit of the average American in 1995, it might be worth going into some background information about how American society came to be receptive to the importation of elements like the Vorkommando Moscow. Now, certainly there are many Americans, both in government and out, who would be opposed to that kind of thing. I have spent much of my professional career exposing some of the scandals and misdeeds of the intelligence community and the military, but there are certainly many people within both, and these are people who contributed to your book, who would regard something like this with horror. And yet, as we remember the Second World War, as we remember the political forces that brought about that cataclysmic event, one which echoes forward to this day, and again, we have recently passed the 50th anniversary of the observation of the 50th anniversary of D-Day. One of the aspects of the history of World War II that has not survived particularly well, and among the many strong points of your book, I think, is the fact that you delve into this in great detail, and that is the fact that not all Americans were opposed to Hitler. In fact, there were some very significant elements of what an author named Burton Hirsch termed the American elite, or the Wall Street elite, who were doing business with Hitler, and in some cases were openly pro-Nazi and pro-fascist.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that back in the 20s and 30s, there was a substantial number of American businessmen and investors who thought that Germany was a dandy place to put their money during the Depression. And when the mark was stabilized, they made a fortune. Now, these people weren't, for the most part, fascists. They didn't much like Hitler. They're generally of the old monarchist crowd. And the German businessmen assured them that, Hitler was just a dog on a chain, and they could, he'd be useful to keep the communists and the labor unions at bay. Well, Hitler broke the chain, seized power, and as one British investor said, it's very hard to emigrate with a steel mill. Their money was already in Germany. And it's an unfortunate fact that 70% of the money that went to finance the Third Reich came from American and British investors.
70%?
70%.
That is a remarkable figure. Many of these people certainly were simply business opportunists. There were, however, some of the industrialists and financiers who did have pro-Nazi and pro-fascist sympathies.
No doubt about that. Not just the financiers. There was Edward Windsor, the King of England at the time, was an outspoken admirer of Hitler. When I was going through some of the classified archives, I found records where the British had wiretapped Windsor and found that he was, not entirely unsympathetic to the Nazi point of view. And this was confirmed by American interrogations of the Nazi Foreign Minister Ribbentrop after the war. Windsor was pretty much on their side.
I wanted to get into the interesting connections of the British royal family to this milieu a little bit later. There are two names that will ring familiar. In fact, there are a number of names that will ring familiar to students of economics and modern American power politics. One of the names that figures most prominently in your book, before dealing with events before, during, and after World War II, is Allen Dulles and his friend, or his brother, John Foster Dulles, a fellow Eisenhower appointee, and also a senior partner in Sullivan and Cromwell. Could you perhaps detail some of the connections between the Dulles brothers, Sullivan and Cromwell, and Third Reich finance and industry?
Certainly. The law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell before World War II was one of the key power centers for the transfer of American investment money into Germany. Sullivan and Cromwell represented most of the major financial houses on Wall Street, companies like Brown Brothers Harriman, for example. A few Americans would realize it, but George Bush's father and grandfather headed up what the U.S. government termed during World War II as Nazi fronts. In fact, their companies were seized after the outbreak of war as outright Nazi fronts, but it didn't quite make the press. Dulles was the lawyer that put together the cloaking mechanisms. And the American investors that put their money in Germany had no qualms about keeping it there during the war. In fact, they operated on both sides of the fence. They made a profit on both sides of World War II.
What was George Bush's ancestors' name, the individuals who were involved with these Nazi
fronts? His namesake was George Herbert Walker.
Right. And, of course, George Bush's full name is George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yeah, and Prescott Bush, George's father, married into Walker's family. He was the son-in-law. And Walker got Prescott seats in all the nice little boards, the Hamburg America line and the various Union Bank. And, in fact, young George dropped out of Yale because he knew that in a few weeks his dad's companies were about to be seized as Nazi fronts, and George enlisted in the Army to save the family's honor.
One of the names that has stood astride American power politics and American finance in the last century or so is, of course, the Rockefeller Company. And the Rockefellers figure prominently in the early part of the book, The Secret War Against the Jews. In fact, one of the things that you discuss is the Rockefellers' secret channeling of oil to the Third Reich, not only before World War II, but during World War II. Could you perhaps detail that for us?
Yeah, Standard Oil Company was one of the major partners in several of the German investment schemes in the 20s and the 30s. And the Rockefeller Company saw Germany as a great place to expand their global investments. Germany, at that time, was the only major nation that allowed monopolies, cartels, if you will, and they also had a real dominant position in international patents. So it was a nice way to organize control of various patents, various technologies, and in effect seek domination of a large portion of the world market. For Rockefeller, when the war broke out, when Britain and Germany were fighting, he saw it as an opportunity for the United States to take over Britain's markets in South America, and he proposed that in writing to President Roosevelt. That's one of the factors that led Rockefeller to become one of our intelligence chiefs in Latin America during World War II. Unfortunately, while he was down there, Nelson didn't quite behave himself. In fact, his company actually leased one of their headquarters to the Nazi Party in the area. And the oil companies continued to do business with the Nazis during the war. It got very embarrassing because particularly with the Saudis, people like Allen Dulles were actually organizing a bit of blackmail against the United States in wartime. There was an actual threat made that if the oil company's ties to Nazi Germany were investigated, that the supply of oil to the U.S. war effort would stop. Then Saudi Arabia, for example, demanded a bribe so that in order to, not to sell oil to Hitler anymore. And we actually paid it. They were the only neutral country in the world to receive Lend-Lease payments during World War II.
And this was to prevent them from shipping oil to the Nazis?
Oh, they already were. They had started it, but and in fact, even after the promise was made, instead of capping their oil wells, they continued to sell to both sides.
This basically, what the actions of the Rockefellers and Allen Dulles constituted treason, did they not?
Oh, yeah, but the trick was to get the evidence. Now, Roosevelt knew that people like Dulles and Rockefeller were involved in very shady deals because British intelligence started bugging them, all right? That's why, for example, even though Allen Dulles was the lawyer for most of the Nazi companies in America, he was offered a job with American intelligence. Now, his office in Rockefeller Plaza was one floor above the British intelligence wiretap unit, and they were trying to get the goods on him. That's, again, one of the reasons why Allen Dulles was transferred to Switzerland in the hopes that our code breakers could keep track of his little shenanigans on behalf of the Germans. Roosevelt had planned to wrap up the whole ball of wax after World War II with a banker's trial at Nuremberg, where the Nazi bankers would then name and indict their American co-conspirators. But after Roosevelt's death, the whole issue was just swept under the rug, and most of them got away with it, except for Nelson Rockefeller.
So that there actually, had Franklin Roosevelt lived and been able to do what he wanted to do, there would have been American industrialists and financiers in the defendant stock at Nuremberg.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a major unit set up called Operation Safe Haven to track where the Nazi money was going towards the end of the war because they were moving all their capital out. And there were a large number of American corporations that were tracked. The Chase Manhattan Bank, for example, was known to be receiving the money. But most of the Nazi money went to South America through various corporations, again, headed by Allen Dulles, who had a lot of experience down there, especially in Argentina. And then the money was then laundered back through a fund called the World Commerce Corporation for investment in West Germany. And that's how the miracle of the West German recovery began in the 50s.
I'd like to read just a few sentences from The Secret War Against the Jews in a chapter, specifically Chapter 4, called The Mutineers. You and Mr. Aaron's right. History books tend to omit the fact that the men who carried out the Holocaust largely went unpunished for their war crimes, an example that haunts us today in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Moreover, the vast bulk of the wealth of the Nazi Empire quietly disappeared before the end of World War II, only to reappear within a decade in the hands of the same men who financed Hitler's war against the Jews. Allen Dulles' clients were not defeated, only inconvenienced. This substantial reversal of the Allied victory, our sources say, was engineered by Dulles through his corrupt protégés James Jesus Angleton and his fascist father, Hugh Angleton. Before we get to the Angletons, and that's something that I wanted to explore in just a couple of minutes, this, again, to the average listener in 1995, might appear absolutely incredible that many of the people involved with Third Reich finance and industry escaped punishment, and that actually during the Second World War, some of the most prominent names in American industry and finance, as well as politics, people like the Rockefellers, people like the Dulleses, were actually engaged, not openly, but they were engaged in business with the Third Reich and committing treason. You talk in this chapter, The Mutineers, about some American and British industrialists who actually sought to undermine the denazification process and to undermine attempts to reverse the political field, so to speak, in Europe. Could you go into that at greater length for us?
Sure. As soon as Roosevelt died, there was a massive effort, particularly inside the U.S. State Department, to undo everything that Roosevelt had tried to do. Morgenthau's plan for the deindustrialization and denazification of Germany was immediately sabotaged.
That was Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury?
Yeah.
Right.
And he had some plans, some of which admittedly were over the top, but his general policy was good. General Eisenhower, for example, was firmly committed to denazification. But for some reason, the major German companies were supposed to be broken up into smaller pieces, never quite were. And many of the Nazi industrialists reemerged from the top. People who had been pardoned from Nuremberg and resumed control of their companies. Outright war criminals from R.G. Farben were smuggled in the United States to go to work for the W.R. Grace Company.
Otto Ambrose was one of those, and in fact, when Mr. Grace died recently, that was one item that figured in a very small way in his obituary, when J. Peter Grace died, that is. One of the things that's interesting, too, as we look back from 1995, the German economic miracle, or quote miracle, unquote, might be a better way of putting it, is obviously one of the economic factors that has dominated the second half of the 20th century, at least the last few decades of it. And as you point out, and as you've already mentioned briefly, much of the capital that went to finance the German economic recovery was actually money that had belonged to the Third Reich and in turn was inextricably linked with this transatlantic industrial and financial nexus that we have been talking about.
Yeah, I don't mean to sound like a one-world conspiracy, but there were a significant, small but significant group of international money men that did their very best to ensure that the West German economy revived immediately, and they had no qualms at all about the Nazis taking power. To give you a classic example, a friend of mine was a prosecutor at Nuremberg in the banking trials, and he was preparing a case against Hermann Abs, who had been director of the Deutsche Bank.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, there never was quite enough money allocated, not enough staff, and a decision was made to terminate the prosecution. The day that the termination decision was made, the British appointed Abs as their economic advisor in the British zone of West Germany.
And it was literally business as usual after that point.
Oh, yeah.
One of the things that is sad to my way of thinking is that the term conspiracy theory has been bandied about so much. I think it often serves to neutralize some important political science and an awareness of history. Certainly some of the proto-fascistic and paranoid conspiracy theories that have been...
I think one of the things that this book, The Secret War Against the Jews, does is debunk the great conspiracy theory that the Jews are all communists and they own all the banks and all the other nonsense that goes along with it. In fact, just from a combination of greed and stupidity, the Jews just ended up being the victims. For example, none of the major Jewish bankers emerged from World War II with their fortunes intact. But if you check the Fortune 500 listings of the world's wealthiest men, you'll find several convicted Nazi war criminals up there.
And it is an interesting. In fact, I was going to, in the last part of our discussion, talk about the relevance of some of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But the sad fact is, though, that as debased as the word has become in our contemporary political lexicon, there are conspiracies afoot. And indeed, in studying the history that you and your co-author, and beyond that, the intelligence sources that you drew upon, and I want to get to that later on in our discussion, you make it quite clear that, in fact, much of our history is being governed secretly by some extremely powerful operators.
I wouldn't say governed. I would say influenced.
Influenced, okay.
Yeah, I think
that'd be a better
that,
word.
Maybe before World War II, the major corporate powers could say had 40% of influence in the U.S., and now I think that's declined to 5 to 10%. There's been a substantial decrease in the power and influence of multinational corporations in terms of politics in America over the last 50 years. But and again, it wasn't really a type of conspiracy that I would use as a criminal prosecutor in terms of a concerted effort to promote fascism. There really were parallel, coincidental targets of opportunity that people wanted to get rich. And dealing with the Germans before World War II, while not immoral, was certainly not illegal either. And it seemed like a good place to invest money, and once the money was in there, they wanted it back.
One, I think, might argue, and this is not a point I want to linger on, Pat, too much due to the interests of time. One could argue, I think, that fascism itself has as its root a desire to make money, suppressing labor and gaining a totalitarian control over industry and finance.
Oh, yeah. In polite British circles, it was called corporatism rather than fascism, that society would best be governed by an elite group of corporate leaders who would make the decisions for the masses without the hindrances of democratic oversight.
Mussolini even referred to his fascist system, and he coined the term as the corporate state. John, you brought up the British elite, and one of the things that figures prominently in yours and Mr. Aaron's book is, on the one hand, the role of the intelligence community, both in this country and in Britain and elsewhere. And in particular, there are a series of fascinating, very important, and frankly, Byzantine intelligence machinations that appear to have exerted a profound influence behind the scenes. Earlier, you alluded to a scandal that bedeviled the British intelligence and the British royal family during World War II, and prior to World War II. The recent VE Day 50th anniversary observations featured footage of the British royal family presiding over the British observation of that anniversary. And yet, as you've already pointed out, and as I'd like you to detail it a little more, the British royal family was not untainted by the stain of fascism, and this actually proved very vexatious to British intelligence over a period of years.
Oh, yeah, I read G. Edgar Hoover's private communication to the Attorney General saying that Windsor was such a dangerous Nazi that it was not enough to intern him on an island during the war, that he actually should be locked up in a prison. Windsor was the guy who wrote to Hitler that Britain would not interfere with his plans concerning the Jews or anything else. Windsor was the guy who, after he was forced to abdicate, was perfectly willing to sell his country's secrets to the Germans, and did. Churchill was frantic that as American Army officers uncovered some of these Nazi records, that they be returned to England as fast as possible to spare further embarrassment.
And this actually had proved to be a thorn in the side of British intelligence for many years after the war. In fact, British intelligence operatives who had participated in the cover-up of the Duke of Windsor's fascist connections. And by the way, he was forced to abdicate he decided to abdicate because he wanted to marry a commoner, an American woman named Wallis Simpson.
Well, that was the public reason given. In fact, the British Secret Service had wiretapped Windsor's phone line and found that he was putting near constant communication with the Nazi embassy in Germany before the war, and was making all sorts of political decisions and promises without consulting with Parliament. And so they had to find a polite way of firing the king.
So that his relationship with Wallis Simpson, you're saying, was actually something of a PR excuse,
yeah,
and not really the main element in his abdication.
Yeah.
John, we are nearing the end of our cassette here. What I would like to do is take a break, and then we'll resume the discussion with some analysis of some fascinating intelligence-related scandals that you go into in your book, the Max Network and the Vessel Scam. But I'd like to do that after a break, and will give us both a chance to rest up and give me a chance to re-cue our cassette. We have been speaking with John Loftus, along with Mark Ahrens, the authors of The Secret War Against the Jews, subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People, published in hardcover by the St. Martin's Press, copyright 1994. We will be back after a break. Once again, it is my privilege to be joined by John Loftus, the co-author of The Secret War Against the Jews, published in hardcover by the St. Martin's Press in 1994. Mr. Loftus's co-author is Mark Ahrens. The book is subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People. John, before the break, we were talking about the fascist connections of the Duke of Windsor and the embarrassment that this caused to the British family, and also the problem that presented to British intelligence, both during the war and after World War II. There was a considerable amount of footage shown on the in the electronic media of the British royal family presiding over the 50th anniversary of the E-Day, or the British observations of same. One of the factors that looms very large in yours and Mr. Ahrens' book is the input of people within the intelligence community, including a group of veteran intelligencers who agreed to participate in yours and Mr. Ahrens' effort on condition of anonymity. You refer to them as the old spies. Could you perhaps just tell us a little bit about them?
These were people principally retired from the U.S. and British intelligence communities who wanted to tell their story of what really happened, but to do so they would do it under the condition of legal anonymity and with knowledge that as an attorney-client I would keep their names confidential, and that in turn, because of my role in working for the Attorney General, they knew that everything I would write would have to be cleared through CIA publication review. So I was a safe person for them to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And their general thrust is that intelligence is the most valuable commodity in the world, and that there was an interlocking relationship between the intelligence agencies and certain of the corporate powers, principally the oil companies, that the links that were made with the original investments in Germany after the war led to a desperate attempt by the people in the intelligence community to cover some of their corporate bosses. They were trying, for example, to assassinate Hitler and put together an alliance between Germany and England against Russia. That failed to come off when the bomb attempt against Hitler failed to take place. And then after the war, their principal concern was to get their money out without anyone finding out in America or England that these were the people that had helped finance the German war machine in the first place.
The old spies have made an invaluable contribution, and perhaps at the risk of seeming a little corny, at the end I'd like to pay tribute, at the end of our interview I'd like to pay tribute to them. John, you mentioned, and perhaps this is a point we've already covered in sufficient depth, but you mentioned that the fascist connections of the Duke of Windsor and his fascist sympathies actually was of considerable embarrassment to British intelligence and actually affected British intelligence for many years after World War II.
Yeah. British intelligence ran around trying to cover up not just Windsor's Nazi connection, but several, unfortunately, prominent right-wing people in Britain had also been involved with some of the Nazi deals and shenanigans. Now, the people in British intelligence who ran the cover-up were, unfortunately, largely communist agents. People today may not recall the name of Kim Philby and some of his cohorts, like the Hunts and the rest, but they were the people who were entrusted with the job of burying this most awful scandal, that they actually had members of the royal family who were on the wrong side of World War II, not to mention a bunch of British businessmen who would have to be in the dock if Windsor ever went on trial. So those communist agents inside Britain who posed as right-wing neo-fascists had the perfect cover. And even after their treason was discovered, they could not be prosecuted because of what they knew about the cover-up of the royal family and the British investors. By and large, they were given immunity or simply allowed to escape to Russia.
The world of what Mad Magazine used to refer to as spy versus spy is a very Byzantine and tortuous one. It's one that I generally try to stay away from in my broadcast simply because it is such a complex situation, and as your book makes quite clear, frequently major intelligence agencies themselves are deceived not only by their enemies but sometimes by their alleged friends.
Oh, my favorite example of that, and we discuss it in the book, is Hitler's secret spy network against Russia, codenamed Max. It was the top secret. They actually had a network of white Russian anti-communists and fascist Jews who every day were delivering to Hitler's generals the top secret mobilization plans of the Red Army. incredibly detailed reports on every move that Stalin was making. So this network, the Max network, even though they were Jews, was protected by the top general staff of the Third Reich. Even after Hitler ordered all the Jews be fired from jobs, these guys stayed on. And what they didn't know, though, was that all through the war, the Max network weren't fascist Jews. They were communist Jews. They were working for the Russian Allies. And the information they were giving Hitler's generals was 99% accurate, except for the occasional day when they went silent. And those were the days we had things like the Battle of Kursk or the Battle of Stalingrad, where the German army suffered their largest defeats. It's probably not hyperbole to say that this intelligence unit, the Max network, was responsible for the Allied victory on the Eastern Front. They literally helped destroy 70% of the Nazi divisions. It was one of the most incredible con games ever perpetrated. And right through the end of the war, the German generals had no idea that they had been taken in so successfully.
Perhaps this would be a case of what Winston Churchill referred to in connection with the RAF and the Battle of Britain, of never have so many owed so much to so few.
Oh, absolutely. It's this small group of Jews actually turned the tide of war in Eastern Europe.
To many of the anti-Semites and fascists that figure in your book, that must have, when it became public, after many years, that must have served as confirmation of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of which they were so fond. John,
unfortunately, though, that doesn't fly, because these Jews were neither fascist Jews nor communist Jews. They were Zionists.
Oh, absolutely.
And they were pro-American.
Yeah.
The first thing we did when the war was over was to blow the whistle on the deal. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, guys like Alan Dulles by then had wormed their way back into U.S. intelligence. And they didn't believe it, or didn't want to believe it. Believe it or not, Alan Dulles actually hired the remnants of the Max network for the CIA during their Cold War operations against Russia.
Sure.
So you can imagine what a hideous embarrassment that was for the agency.
Absolutely. And again, I was not indicating that they were, in fact, Zionist conspirators, but I can picture some of these fascists, upon learning of that and saying, you see, we told you, you can't trust the Jews. They're everywhere, and they lurk behind every bush, and there's a pun there. Yeah. One of the intelligence scams that you get into in your book, and one which, like so many of the others, had ramifications for literally decades, stretching right on up into George Bush's tenure as Director of Central Intelligence, mm-hmm. and that is the Vessel scandal, a truly Byzantine intelligence, counterintelligence machination, which I found reading it. I'm a pretty good reader, and I'm a veteran of this type of research, but I had to make diagrams to follow the players. It
was really cute. I'll try and simplify it. What happened is, a group of American fascists headed by Hugh Angleton, the father of Jim Angleton, volunteered for intelligence service in Rome after World War II because they were working, unfortunately, with the Vatican to rescue a lot of the Nazi money that was coming out. And in order to con President Roosevelt and later President Truman into adopting, to changing their policies, Angleton actually forged Vatican cables. They were codenamed Vessel. And they were delivered right to the President of the United States. And this supposedly was the most secret intelligence from inside the Vatican.
Now, this was James Jesus Angleton.
Jesus Angleton.
Right. And his father, Hugh, was a fascist sympathizer who was working with National Cash Register.
Oh, yeah, that was before the war.
Right, before the war.
Yeah. And then during the war, he was setting up an intelligence network. We still can't tell which side it was on. But after the war, Hugh Angleton was in Rome trying to rescue the remnants of the business investors of the Third Reich, and largely succeeded.
The Vessel scam continued to echo through the corridors of U.S. intelligence for a long period of time after World War II. And in fact, one of the things you discuss in your book is that as it became clear, finally, in the 1970s, what had been going on, there appears to have been some tampering with the Vessel files, and that this occurred on George Bush's watch as Director of Central Intelligence.
What happened is when the new Freedom of Information Act was passed, a Vatican historian, Father Graham, asked for copies of the Vessel files because he thought it was just referred to a minor incident in intelligence history. Well, the CIA was thrown into an uproar. The Vatican saw these cables. They would know at once that they were phony, so they called Jim Angleton from retirement and had him go through and censor and shred most of the cables. And you can actually see on the original documents where Angleton put a black magic marker through the cable references. They would look as if they were not cables at all, but simply paraphrases of conversations. So Angleton went to work in the shredding, and still only a little bit of the documents were released to the Vatican. But Father Graham immediately recognized that this was part of a larger forgery context, so he didn't know the whole story. I was fortunate in that one of the retired spies, a guy by the name of Bill Gowan, who lives in New York City and decided to go public to help with this, was able to go back and compare some of the original Italian court records with the CIA files that I obtained, and we discovered they were in fact complete forgeries. And the CIA did their own investigation, confirmed it, and informed the National Archives that they'd have to put a clear warning label on these stack of files. It was amazing. But the bottom line is, here were American intelligence officers passing forged information to the President of the United States, not to mention the other U.S. intelligence agencies.
I think it serves to underscore once again, as does so much of your book, the importance of the world of espionage and intelligence within the framework of power politics. Unfortunately, when one deals in an academic sense with the intelligence community, one is dismissed as conspiracy theorist or worse. And frankly, I have worn that scarlet letter with all of the personal and professional consequences that entails. And yet, although there's certainly a lot of that research that is shabby or nutty, and there are plenty of loose cannons in this field, it is a terribly important area of study. And I think much of our understanding of history has been impaired by the failure of political scientists and historians to come to terms with what you and your co-author, courtesy of the old spies as well as your own formidable academic research, have come to terms with it. And it's one of the strong points of your book.
Yeah, I think that one-third of modern history is classified. It's buried down in those archives. And now, bit by bit, they're being declassified, and we have to rewrite our previous concept of history. There's another author, Chris Simpson, who did a wonderful book on Dulles and the early banking things, and citing directly to recently released State Department correspondence files.
I believe that's called The Splendid Blonde Beast.
Yeah.
And he did a wonderful book, although you and your co-author take issue with some of the vessel material as it related to this book, and that is the book Blowback. Both books, by the way, familiar. Both books familiar to my audience. Also, one thing I was very pleased about when I read The Secret War Against the Jews is that you paid kudos to another book that I think is a remarkable effort, also a very recent book, and a book which was simply ignored, and that is The Old Boys, The American Elite and the Origins of the CIA by Burton Hirsch.
Yeah, any book like Simpson's or Burton Hirsch's or Charles Hyams that talks about corporate links and the intelligence links either does not get reviewed in the New York Times or gets bashed. Simpson's book, my book, will never get reviewed.
It's one of the reasons why I'm doing this interview. I think you have written as important a book as I can recall reading, and I think it's a book which people across this country and around the world and across the political spectrum, frankly, from progressive to conservative, should read and take very seriously.
We're not taking any political bias here. We're simply telling the truth. This is what happened. Our only agenda is to tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may. I'm Irish Catholic. I have no agenda one way or the other. This is simply a history, an oral history that these guys had really happened in our century, and there's an enormous amount of documentary evidence to back it up.
Amen. There's an old Turkish proverb, by the way: "He who tells the truth gets chased out of 9 villages."
So listen, I just wanted to be the first whistleblower in America to break even.
Or perhaps, at the very least, he who did updating it to the contemporary journalistic framework. He who tells the truth does not get reviewed by the New York Times Book Review.
Yeah. I had a hilarious call from people in the intelligence community saying, there's a real whispering campaign going about the book, telling people not to review it. And sure enough, our book was front page in Britain and Israel, Australia. Not here.
Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't surprise me.
It's a bit too embarrassing.
Yeah, well, it is, and...
we've named the airport in Washington the Dulles Airport.
Indeed.
After a guy whom Supreme Court Justice Goldberg said was an American traitor.
Yeah, and of course, he was CIA director when his brother John Foster, a partner in these treasonous machinations, was Secretary of State.
Oh, yeah.
Something that we were speaking about the intelligence scandals that the book discusses and the role of blackmail as it applies to international power politics. In the first part of our interview, we were discussing the collusion, treasonous in many cases, between key American industrialists and financiers and the fascist powers of Europe, chiefly the Third Reich. We were discussing the Rockefeller family and their channeling of oil to the Third Reich, not only before World War II, but during World War II as well. One of the things that you get into in The Secret War Against the Jews is the subterranean power politics, or the behind-the-scenes power politics with regard to the creation of the State of Israel, something that was viewed...
Don't you think it's sort of curious that Ben-Gurion was able to get two-thirds of the nations in the UN to vote for the creation of Israel? I mean, even the anti-Semitic states. They did it with blackmail. And Rockefeller was a key guy involved in that. 3 days before the vote for the partition of Palestine, the Zionists realized there'd be several votes short of the two-thirds majority. So a Zionist delegate went to see Nelson Rockefeller and dumped all the evidence on his desk of Rockefeller's giving aid and comfort to the enemy during wartime. And the Jews offered to trade silence in return for votes. In 3 days, Nelson Rockefeller turned around every nation in Latin America. They all either voted in favor of Israel or abstained, which was just as important to reach the two-thirds majority.
So that basically the Rockefeller collusion with the Third Reich was used as leverage to obtain the necessary votes in the United Nations.
Yeah.
Much of the opposition to the creation of the State of Israel within the United States came from this same transatlantic industrial and financial axis. People like
James Forrestal.
That took the words right out of my mouth.
Yep. Go ahead. He was Secretary of Defense. He was also one of the directors of Brown Brothers Harriman. That was one of the companies that invested in the Nazis.
Was he involved with Dillon Reed as well?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes. I think he was the vice president of Dillon Reed.
Okay.
And ostensibly a Democrat, but his loyalties really lay more with the corporate powers. And they were the people who wanted to make the Middle East safe for Hitler during the war. And then after the war, really wanted to get Arab oil. And, the Jews were just seen as an obstacle, a hindrance, just as we ignored all the intelligence information that poured in about the Holocaust, and we made the Jews expendable during World War II. We were perfectly willing to make Israel expendable. And Forrestal led the campaign behind Truman's back to make sure that our State Department would not permit the State of Israel to be born. In fact, as Harry Truman noted in his diary, he was amazed to wake up and read the newspapers one day and found that the State Department had issued their own decisions on Palestine without even consulting him, after Truman had promised that the opposite result would happen. Forrestal, at the time he was involved with all these machinations, was secretly working on the Dewey campaign to undercut Truman to get him out of office.
Now, Forrestal, of course, was nominally at least a Democrat.
And a member of Truman's cabinet. And stabbing Truman in the back every chance he could. That's why Truman, after the re-election, forced Forrestal to retire. One of the other reasons, though, was that Forrestal was going mad. He was quite literally insane, and committed suicide shortly after he was forced out of office. But just a despicable man.
Something which might be, it's a slight digression, and a digression on my part, and I don't want to linger on it, but I've often wondered in examining far right-wing literature, such as John Birch Society literature, the Rockefellers are accused of being communists and agents of the Zionist conspiracy, which is about as far from the truth as one could possibly get. The Rockefellers are most assuredly not communists, and they most assuredly are not Jews or Zionists or anything else.
Well, I don't think they have any political thoughts. I think it's just simply dollars liberalis.
Yeah, the thing that I've wondered is, after reading your book, that had always left me scratching my head. And after reading your book, I wonder to what extent that may stem from Rockefellers having marshaled the votes in the United Nations on behalf of Palestine as a result of that blackmail. Again, it's simply an aside. One of the things that we've already touched on at the very beginning of our interview, John, and this is another of the historical threads that winds through the immediate post-World War II period on up through the Cold War, right on up to the present time. In speaking about the Vorkommando Moscow, we have already touched on something that to most people would appear to be an oxymoron, if ever there was one, and that is the Fascist Freedom Fighters program. Could you once again detail that for us, and in particular, the role in that of people like Alan Dulles?
Yeah, the British Secret Service contacted a group of like-minded Americans, Alan Dulles and Forrestal and a few others, to say that we've got to recruit these members of the fascist parties in Eastern Europe in case World War III breaks out. They'll be our secret army to fight the communists. And, Roosevelt and Truman knew nothing about this. And finally, when Eisenhower came into office, the people who had been bringing the Nazis in and covering it up were suddenly promoted to positions of great power. Alan Dulles became head of CIA, his brother became Secretary of State, and Vice President Nixon became the guy in charge of the Freedom Fighters program. Now, it wasn't until '56, when we had the horrible debacle with the Hungarian uprising, that we really began to realize that these networks that Kim Philby had sold us were just riddled with Soviet agents. We lost nearly 97% of the agents we sent behind the Iron Curtain because these Nazi networks were pipelined directly to Moscow. So it was an enormous political scandal. What do we do with the Nazis in America? Do we investigate them, find out which ones are communists? The whole thing was swept under the rug. Richard Nixon wanted to run for president. And after he lost to Kennedy by 1%, he had a new use for the Nazi ethnic groups. They would be his answer to offset the Jewish vote in the United States.
This gets into an aspect of the importation of some of these Nazi collaborators and war criminals, some of whom were also, that milieu was also penetrated by Soviet intelligence. One thing I've wondered about is also the extent to which there might have been some triple and quadruple agents, some of those also working for German and or American intelligence, but that again remains part of the enigma of the intelligence world. Two other names crop up in connection with the fascist freedom fighters program, names familiar to contemporary audiences, those of Ronald Reagan and William Casey, his director
as I was going through the files in the classified vaults, I found that Casey was the intelligence officer assigned in New York to work with the International Rescue Committee. That was the front group that were used to relocate the British intelligence agents, and they could come through without FBI checks. And Casey needed a front group, so he hired a young movie actor named Ronald Reagan to be the public relations man for the Crusade for Freedom. And that's where Americans were supposed to, school kids send their pennies in to help fund the freedom fighters. Well, it turns out that 99% of the funding from the Crusade for Freedom actually came from State Department intelligence accounts. Now, Casey knew that the money was going for the Freedom Fighters Project and knew who, certainly these were former fascists. Reagan didn't. He was just a useful frontman. But you can imagine my concern, as I was reading these files, Ronald Reagan had just been elected President of the United States, and Bill Casey had just been nominated head of the CIA.
Indeed.
Yeah, that was one of the factors that led me to resign from the Justice Department.
I can understand why. One of the things that I had wondered about in examining the history of involvement between our intelligence agencies and the residue of the Third Reich's intelligence agencies, I had wondered to what extent some of them might actually have been deemed useful for a domestic political standpoint. And indeed, in your book, you and your co-author, Mr. Ahrens, present some very compelling documentation that, in fact, these Third Reich imports were useful not so much as intelligence operatives, because they had their liabilities on both the right and left-wing political ends of the political spectrum, but that they were actually employed quite consciously as a domestic political force. I found that shocking and very important.
It's the most shocking part of the book, I think. We found a document in Australian intelligence files of a briefing from the Nixon administration in the early 70s, saying, in essence, we know where the Nazis are in America, but we're keeping quiet about it because these Eastern European groups are important to get out the ethnic vote in 5 key states. But the Americans advised the Australians that the Nixon administration was taking precautions. They would, for example, warn selected politicians not to go near the Croatian groups on April 10th, because that was the day they celebrated when Hitler established the Nazi puppet government in Croatia.
Mm-hmm.
So there's clearly no doubt they were talking about Nazis. So it's really a very cynical document. We trace the evolution of this. After Nixon's narrow loss to Kennedy and the defeat of narrow loss of Dewey to Truman, Nixon was determined to mobilize his own bloc. He was convinced that the American Jews had always voted Democratic and were his enemies, so he needed a bloc to offset them. So the Eastern European groups had, despite their fascist natures, had been dropped overwhelmingly by the U.S. intelligence community. So Nixon recruited their leaders to form an ethnic committee. He promised that if he won the election in '68 that he would make them a permanent part of the Republican National Committee, and he did. That's where the ethnic heritage section of the Republican National Committee came from. Now, the guy who was in charge of that operation was the chair of the RNC at that time was George Bush.
And you and your co-author speculate that one of the things that may very well have laid at the bottom of the Watergate scandal, one of the pieces of submerged truth that might have proved most explosive and the most damaging had it emerged, was this fascist freedom fighter and Republican Ethnic Heritage Council Nazi connection.
Yeah, Nixon was determined to stay in office until George Bush wrote him a letter saying that he had to go, because this would have opened a huge can of worms. In fact, though, Bush later recruited some of the same people for his campaigns. If you remember, there was a brief scandal in the press where 6 members of the ethnic outreach section of Bush's campaign were identified as former fascists.
Indeed, it did not get the publicity in 1988 I felt it deserved.
Oh, no, and that was just a handful. And the Republicans have never released the names of the rest of the people on this thing, and we identified several of them, and they were just, former fascists, professional fascists during World War II. They were our enemies during the war.
And they were actually viewed as mobilizers in order to get out the ethnic vote in a number of swing states.
Yeah, the Nazis for Nixon program.
And it was something like 5 key states were seen as possibly up for grabs, depending on the allegiances of this group, this Nazi element, basically, of the Republican Party. John, we're once again running low on tape here, so I'd like to take a break, and after this break, we will continue this interview. I'm speaking with John Loftus, along with Mark Ahrens, the author of The Secret War Against the Jews, subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People, published in hardcover by the St. Martin's Press, copyright 1984. We will return with Mr. Loftus after a break. I'm speaking with John Loftus, along with Mark Ahrens, the co-author of The Secret War Against the Jews, subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People. The book was published in hardcover by the St. Martin's Press and copyrighted 1994. John, welcome once again back to our airwaves.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's good to be here.
We were speaking before we took a break about something that would appear very shocking to the average American. In fact, I'd say about 99% of the book would appear very shocking to the average American. We were talking about the importation of Third Reich collaborators and war criminals into the United States in order to, among other things, use them as a political leverage to perceived Jewish electoral dominance in certain key states in the United States. And this actually evolved into a wing of the Republican Party, the Republican Ethnic Heritage Council.
It's the Ethnic Outreach Division of the Republican National Committee.
Oh, that's what the Ethnic Outreach Division?
Yeah.
Okay. Something which had actually attracted national attention as recently as 1988, although not nearly as much as I think it should have. It's interesting to me that we're having Attorney General nominees and CIA Director of Central Intelligence nominees being disqualified for public office because they hired a nanny that was an illegal immigrant and didn't report it on their income tax returns. And yet we have some illegal immigrants of an entirely different nature here, and their importation has not created the political scandal that I think is due it.
It was absolutely, I was astonished. When I went on 60 Minutes, we actually had Nazis confess on camera that they entered the country illegally. Their whole background was known to the FBI, for example. And it caused a small national uproar, and eventually there was a congressional investigation. But the press didn't show up. I walked in with U.S. intelligence documents naming the Nazis, the General Accounting Office. I'd given them 6 names of top Nazis working for U.S. intelligence. They confirmed it all. Press didn't report it.
And you were at the time, of course, working for the U.S. Justice Department.
Yeah.
No,
at the time of the congressional hearings, I had resigned from the Justice Department.
Oh, okay. So you were previously working for the Office of Special Investigations, but had resigned basically when the very people you were investigating wound up moving into the White House to a certain extent.
And Nixon actually had some of the higher-ranking Nazis come visit him. So did Ronald Reagan, for that matter. Mm-hmm. He had a guy come down from Canada who was the head of a British group called the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, and the fellow was actually one of the Ukrainian Nazis during World War II.
Was this Yaroslav Stetsko?
Yep.
Yep. A name I know well. This is not discussed in your book, although the name is mentioned ever so briefly. There's a fellow named Otto von Bolschwing, who was a key SS man during World War II and also went to work for U.S. intelligence. I know he's mentioned briefly in your book. There's an article that was published here in the Silicon Valley in the San Jose Mercury News in 1981, and among the names that was connected with von Bolschwing was a woman named Helena von Dahm, who was involved as, I think, special White House assistant for executive personnel. Mm-hmm. Did you ever come across her name in the course of your investigation?
Oh, that's very well known. That Helene Van Damme, I think she was later Ambassador Van Damme, wasn't she?
She later became U.S. Ambassador to Austria, correct?
Yeah, and she was Ronald Reagan's secretary for a while, and then he was in the White House, his close advisor. Von Bolschwing was actually a pretty significant figure in terms of U.S. intelligence. When, after the peace treaty was finally signed in West Germany, we weren't getting the cooperation from the Gehlen organization we used to, so von Bolschwing's job was to try and set up a new German intelligence network loyal to the United States. And it's sort of interesting, since among the jobs that von Bolschwing held during World War II was, for a while, he was the assistant to Adolf Eichmann.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, von Bolschwing was the guy who went to Palestine before the war to see if there was some way that Germany could dump their Jews there. But von Bolschwing was discovered that the Arabs would have no part of that. So von Bolschwing, according to our sources, was the guy who engineered one of the most successful con games in history. Kim Philby's father was a British fascist by the name of Jack Philby. And Jack and Alan Dulles had helped promote the coup that created the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was their ploy to have find one corner of the Middle East that would sign contracts with American oil companies, which, of course, the king promptly did. But during World War II, Philby pretended to be a close friend of the Zionist leaders, particularly Weizmann. And Philby offered this ransom proposal where 14 and then 20 million pounds were paid to Ibn Saud. They could send as many Jews as they wanted to Palestine. And the Jews, of course, were desperate as the Holocaust was progressing. And they really explored this. The whole thing blew up in their face. It was all a publicity coup designed to discredit any attempts to move Jews to Palestine and to slam the door on Jewish immigration just as the Holocaust was getting underway.
Have you ever seen or heard discussed, and again, I don't want to linger on the point too much or put you on the spot, have you ever heard the von Bolschwing relationship discussed? Because I've touched on it on my program, but it doesn't seem to have gathered much attention in the media.
No, my impression was that there just wasn't much to it, to be honest. That Reagan was just one of those nice fellows that read his speeches well and did what he was told, and really didn't have a clue. That's what was going on. He counted on his intelligence advisors like Casey to help him on that score.
Right.
And, Casey was as crooked as they came. He was strictly in this for the money. One of his subordinates at CIA told me how that after Casey was forced to put his investments into a blind trust, he used his CIA courier to relay instructions to the trust every day. When you're head of CIA, you can make wonderful investments.
Sure. Reagan himself appears to have been largely an observer of his own administration, unfortunately. I was just wondering about the von Bolschwing connection, because it was discussed in an article right here in the Silicon Valley, and in fact some of the connections were here, but it's not a point I want to linger on. Something that I found absolutely astounding, and something that I think looms very large, not only for Americans of Jewish descent, but for all Americans. And in particular, in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, there has been a lot of discussion of the need to increase police and surveillance powers in order to combat terrorism. There has been discussion, and in fact, that President Clinton has proposed to allow the military to participate in a counter-terrorist capability, and there's been much discussion of the need for counterterrorism balanced against the preservation of traditional American civil liberties. In The Secret War Against the Jews, you discuss an absolutely astounding connection, which, like so many of the things that you talk about in your book, has its genesis during World War II. And this is a collaborative program between the National Security Agency and also the FBI and British intelligence, which dates back to the William...
To 1944, the British...
Yeah, the William Stevenson, I was about to say William Sullivan, but the William Stevenson Operation Safe Haven wiretaps.
Yeah, the British were allowed to set up electronic surveillance posts in the U.S. before we got in the war. They were to keep track of those American businessmen that were helping the Nazis. That's how Roosevelt was getting his secret information. Well, in 1944, the British wanted to use the American listening posts for another purpose. They were terrified that American Jews would send money and arms to Palestine and help create the State of Israel, and that would be anathema to the Arabs. So the British asked the FBI if they could bug American Jews. And Hoover, who was a great anti-Semite himself, said sure, he thought it was a dandy idea. So over the years, the wiretap program is involved. And here's how it works. We have the British intelligence liaison targets names into the computers at Fort Meade. And so we have the British uses American equipment to bug American Jews. And then in England, we use American intelligence officers use British equipment to bug British Jews. That way each side can claim to their own government, no, we don't spy on our own citizens. And of course, the truth is that they exchange information. So it's a very clever process. I first asked permission to write about it during the Reagan administration, and every word of the British wiretap program, I was ordered to delete it. from my book, and I was not able to publish at the time. Under the Clinton administration, there's a whole new breath of fresh air, and a lot of people worked very hard to give me permission to go public with this. The Bill of Rights is meaningless now, because in the age of this international surveillance, we can literally tell the computers to search for the sound of your voice or the mention of your name. We can listen to conversations in your home through a telephone receiver hung up on the hook. The technology is quite superb. I mean, but the collection program, next to communists and black activists, the American Jews were the most highly surveilled group in America, mostly for political reasons, because they tend to be pro-democratic and involved with liberal causes and pro-Israel. And this was always dandy to give the Arabs little snippets of information. But it just gotten out of hand. By the time of the Bush administration, we were collecting rosters of kids going to Jewish summer camps. I mean, it was just absurd. The project had just grown totally out of control.
And in fact, the United States has been doing the same thing for Britain. We've been surveilling their citizens, and I believe it's pronounced Menwith Hill in Britain, where we do the same thing for the British that they have been doing for us, namely electronically surveilling our citizens, which permits both countries to deny superficially that they spy on their own citizens.
Oh, sure. Any long-distance call you make in America goes through a microwave relay tower, and all the microwave things are just simply picked up and recorded. Giant vacuum cleaners. That's all the surveillance program is. The real intrusion on privacy comes when your name is targeted into the computer. And they actually fiddled around with a statute, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It was supposed to prohibit targeting of any American citizen, but the last-minute words were inserted to prohibit targeting by the NSA. So that left a big loophole that they could still be targeted by the British using NSA equipment.
And the program at NSA, the British NSA Joint Surveillance Program, with regard to American Jews, was actually nicknamed the Jew Room, although, as you point out, it's more than one room.
Oh, yeah. There was one section of NSA to which no American Jew, no matter how loyal, no matter how patriotic, would ever be admitted, because the bottom line is very embarrassing. In every war that Israel's fought, U.S. and British intelligence have given all of Israel's secrets to the Arabs.
That is something that as fate would have it, and it's not exactly fate, it's sort of the outline I had drawn up. That is the next major subject I wanted to take up. I wanted to point out briefly in passing, though, that a recent issue of the European, a relatively conservative publication, discussed the foundations now being laid for a pan-European intelligence liaison, in which all of the European or all of the EU intelligence agencies, including the BND, which descended from the Gehlen organization from World War II, will be sharing intelligence. And one of the things that was mentioned in connection with this was the British enthusiasm to join, but the problems that the NSA GCHQ liaison might present in that regard. If that's overcome, this would permit any European intelligence agency, including the Germans, to surveil any British or American citizen, including any and all Jews, if they wanted. So, again, this is not to, as you pointed out in an earlier part of the interview, talk about one world government or any of the crazy right-wing conspiracy theories, yet international cooperation and collaboration on a scale that most people would never dream of is, and as your book so amply illustrates for decades, has been a matter of reality.
Yeah, I'm quite concerned about intelligence sharing agreements with governments where the intelligence services have no democratic oversight. For example, in Britain, the British Secret Service is not reviewed in Parliament. In Germany, the operations of the BND are not reviewed by the legislature there. It causes me some concerns. I think we do need to increase our intelligence sharing on counterterrorism. We do need to swap information on drugs. But I think by and large, we've got to have a better balance between the need for national security and the need for democratic oversight.
One of the debates that has raged within the progressive political community in recent years, one which I don't think is particularly intelligent past a point, I think it has some merit, but that has been institutional analysis versus conspiracy theory, which I think to a certain extent is a false dichotomization. One of the things that your book does very effectively, I think, and I think it's one of the most important aspects of the secret war against the Jews, is that your book illustrates in dramatic and exhaustive fashion how so many of the, what for lack of a better term might be termed field-level intelligence operations are actually conducted not only at the behest of, but beyond that, actually as an extension of major industrial and financial interests operations, and in particular, something that looms very large in your book, as it looms ever so large in our lives, is that little three-letter word, oil.
Oh, yeah. I think the bottom line in U.S. and British foreign policy towards the Middle East is oil. If Moses had turned right and settled in Kuwait, we probably would have tried to make Israel the 51st state. But the Jews don't have any oil, and they're expendable. The Arabs largely view the Jews as a threat, as a rebuttal of their tribal dictatorships, and put an enormous amount of pressure on the Western governments to do everything possible to undercut the Israelis. Now, we can't do that publicly because the American public and the American Congress genuinely support Israel. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. But privately, our intelligence services have been waging a secret war to aid the Arabs. It's a totally contradictory foreign policy. And it works in a very subtle way. For years, members of the Near East South Asia desk of CIA have retired and gone to work for the oil companies in the Middle East and then come back to CIA as consultants. So they can actually manipulate the data that's coming through the CIA to the president. And we gave several shocking examples of how they were able to deceive the Carter administration into believing that there was going to be a shortfall of production in the Middle East, and that the Russians were running out of oil and they were going to invade the Middle East. And therefore, we had to stop arming the Jews and arm the Saudis.
This is something I wanted to get into in just a couple of minutes. Yeah. But before that, I think it might be interesting to explore some of the subterranean intelligence machinations with regard to some of the Mideast wars. Now, in the 1956 war, U.S. intelligence, and again some of the petroleum-related elements and names such as Alan Dulles and Miles Copeland, figured prominently in betraying the Israeli war plans to President Nasser of Egypt.
Oh, absolutely. We were telling the Israelis, oh, sure, we think it's a great idea you and Britain go in and overthrow Nasser. Privately, we wanted to get Nasser on our side, and we did. By reversing position right after the invasion was launched, and then we launched a worldwide economic embargo against Britain that sent the pound crashing. Britain was simply cut off from oil. We moved in, swept up the market. It was one of the most lucrative operations ever conducted.
The postscript to that, too, in another 1950s intelligence operation, connected with some of these same names, Nazi war criminals, some of them intelligencers, some of them scientists, were put to work in the Mideast, operating nominally at least under the auspices of U.S. intelligence and Alan Dulles, and again Miles Copeland figured in this operation. Among the things they were doing, in addition to shoring up Egyptian intelligence, was putting together not only chemical warfare capabilities but guided missile capabilities to use against Israel. Yeah.
And the irony is that people like Copeland have admitted that indeed they were shipping Nazis to Nasser, to the Egyptians. But Copeland said, oh, they were just, dim-witted Germans. They didn't really count for much. And in fact, they were some of Germany's best rocket scientists, bacteriological warfare specialists, and chemical warfare specialists. The Germans, because of the experiments they were able to conduct on Jews at Auschwitz, had developed some very, very powerful nerve gases. Among them, for example, was sarin that we just saw recently in the Japanese subway attack.
Right.
And a warhead filled with sarin could do a lot of damage in a crowded urban area. So the Jews were very, very upset by this. And quite frankly, it's acknowledged now we were sending Nazis to Egypt to aid the Egyptian war against Israel.
This eventually, like so many of the operations you discuss in your book, became an element of blackmail and actually was used almost in an Oriental martial arts sense to defeat the wielder of the sword, so to speak. You and Mr. Ahrens discuss how this information was not publicized by the Israelis, but actually used to blackmail West Germany, among other countries, into helping to give Israel the equipment it needed to obtain its nuclear capability.
Yeah, and at the same time, they were blackmailing Richard Nixon. Did you ever wonder why Nixon, the great anti-Semite, ended up giving more arms to Israel than all American presidents combined?
Mm-hmm.
They had the goods on them. Besides, the Israelis couldn't go public and say, oh, gee, shame on these Americans, you hired Nazis. America was the only ally they had. And the Israelis knew this wasn't an American program. This was a small group of people, principally in the State Department, and the political appointees, who were misusing American intelligence for their own profit.
In the Six-Day War, the petroleum intelligence axis, and I use the term advisedly, came into play once again, and again the collaboration between British intelligence and the NSA loomed large. anti-Semitic elements in the United States have long focused on the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty as proof not only of the perfidy of the Israelis, but also the fact that they obviously secretly control the United States, because otherwise we would have condemned this attack.
The truth is a bit more in between. What happened is that because of the stunning Israeli successes in defeating the Egyptians in the Sinai, Lyndon Johnson, who was an oil man himself, was very concerned that we might have problems with our oil supply, so he wanted to throw the Arabs a bone, but secretly. So we sent our best electronic spy ship, the Liberty, off the coast of Israel. And the Liberty's job, but they didn't know it, was they were to monitor and record all of the passing Israeli tank and jeep radio traffic. And this was bounced literally off the surface of the moon, back to Maryland, then back to England, and by landline to Cyprus. What the British were giving the Egyptians with the finished product was a map of where all the holes were in the Israeli southern front, because the Israelis were pulling their victorious troops out of the area to prepare for the assaults on Jerusalem and on the Golan. Well, what the Lyndon Johnson didn't know was that the Israelis had a spy on the Egyptian general staff. And so the cabinet went to secret session, and they knew the diplomatic protest wouldn't do them any good. They'd lose some 25,000 Israeli casualties if the Liberty was allowed to continue its spying. So what they decided to do is they could have sunk the ship with a single bomb, no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
But instead they decided to go with a minimum loss of casualties. They strafed the ship so the crew ran below deck and safely buttoned up. Then they burned off the antennas with napalm, and then they put one torpedo in the watertight hole where the spy gear was. 90% of the crew of the Liberty survived. It was the best they could do. And then the Israelis called in the American intelligence liaison and told them what they had done and why. And Lyndon Johnson asked the Israelis to pretend that the attack on the Liberty was a mistake, and Israel was quietly reimbursed for all the compensation it paid.
And this, had it been allowed to continue, would have permitted Nasser to identify right on up to, or Egyptian military intelligence, right on up to individual Israeli tanks and platoon-sized units.
They would have known exactly where the holes were in the Israeli southern front to prepare for a counterattack.
In addition to the Liberty scam, and I found it fascinating the way you and Mr. Ahrens, with the assistance of your intelligence sources, documented the actual pattern of the attack on the Liberty and why it was conducted the way it was conducted. It simply never occurred to me that the attack might have unfolded as deliberately as it did. Another shocking example of the politics of oil, and also something which could perhaps involve some of the same Nazi-related elements that we have also we've examined already, and that concerns an individual who had also worked with the fascist freedom fighters program, and that is Nixon's Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger.
Oh yeah, in the next war, Kissinger got even for the Liberty incident. What happened is, 4 days before the war, the NSA broke a Russian code coming out of Lebanon, giving the exact date and hour of the three-way Arab sneak attack on Israel, and the White House made a decision not to tell the Jews. As Kissinger later confided to a friend, he wanted to let the Israelis get bloodied a bit, but come out ahead, so they'd be more amenable to his demands at the peace table. So we didn't warn the Israelis that the attack was coming. And worse, once it started, Kissinger told them that they had to let the Arabs fire the first shot, or they wouldn't get any American resupply. Now, Kissinger was going to drag his feet for 7 days before resupplying the Israelis, and the idea was that Israel only had a 7-day supply of ammunition, so they'd be on their knees and would do whatever Kissinger told them to do. But what Kissinger didn't know was that there was another guy in the White House who was horrified by all of this. And the guy who saved Israel in the 73 war was the White House Chief of Staff, Alexander Haig.
You yourself, John, had direct participation in this situation. One of the things that you point out in your book, and something that I'd like you to explain to our audience, is that you were functioning, I believe it was at Fort Bragg?
No, at Fort Benning in Georgia.
Fort Benning, Georgia, excuse me.
On the first day of the 73 war, Haig called the Israelis and told them we had this new top-secret weapon, the TOW missile, that could blow up any tank within 3 kilometers. So an unmarked plane picked up 40 Israeli field-grade commanders, flew them to Fort Benning, Georgia, and I was the young Army officer who trained the Israelis on the TOW missile system.
Well, what is a duty? Excuse me for interrupting, John, but what is a duty officer? That's something that would not be known to most of
I was, on a weekend, they take a junior officer and put him in charge of the battalion headquarters.
Mm-hmm.
And on that weekend, I was the guy who happened to be stationed there, and the decision was made that we would hide the Israelis in my unit, and I would conduct the initial training briefing, and then we would take them out to the ranges on Monday.
Briefly,
Sunday and Monday.
Excuse me. Briefly, what is could you explain the TOW missile and its strategic significance in that time? Because later in the Iran-Contra scandal, which we'll get to in the next part of our interview, those missiles figured prominently once again.
Oh, yeah, the TOW missile is a neat little invention. It has sort of a binocular attached to it. And as the missile is fired, it unrolls a cable behind it. And as the enemy tank goes up and downhill, you follow it with your binoculars up and downhill, and the missile follows the binoculars up and downhill and hits the enemy tank 99 times out of 100. Devastating weapon. And so we stripped every TOW missile we had from the east coast of the United States and Germany and sent them to Israel. And the Israelis rushed them down to the Mitla and Gitla passes. And when the Egyptian army the armored tanks came rolling up for the final assault on Israel, they all blew up. Now, to protect Al Haig, the Israelis claimed that they blew up all of the Egyptian tanks with the Israeli Air Force. The only problem was when American Army officers conducted a battlefield inspection, they couldn't find any holes in the top of the tanks. They'd all been blown up from the side.
And, of course, tanks are most vulnerable from above, where they have the least armor. One of the things that you mentioned in connection with Henry Kissinger's attempt to bloody the Jews but have them come out ahead, something which almost resulted in the annihilation of Israel. You mentioned that the Israeli leaders, including Golda Meir, were actually preparing to commit suicide.
Yeah, they're giving it serious thought.
One of the things that you discuss in that connection but don't draw any conclusions from, and that is Henry Kissinger's own background when he worked for the Pentagon with the fascist freedom fighters operation. Could you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, Henry Kissinger was actually left the Army and went into a very covert civilian operation. He was stationed first in Germany, where we kept all the files on the Nazi recruitment, and then when he went to Harvard, he worked on an intelligence program to recruit foreign students. And then he became a consultant for Allen Dulles at the highest levels of U.S. intelligence. Now, there was no direct evidence that Henry Kissinger ever recruited a Nazi, but he was certainly right in the middle of every office where the Freedom Fighter program was being organized and directed.
I know during World War II he worked for the 970th Counterintelligence Corps, which did do some work against Nazis and also brought in some people like Otto Skorzeny and Klaus Barbie, according to the records.
The CIC has taken the blame for all these operations because people in the other spy agencies, particularly the State Department spy agency, wore CIC uniforms.
Aha, okay.
Kissinger left CIC, became a civilian, then received a captain's commission. He went from sergeant to captain in the military intelligence service, and then became a civilian consultant for these very, very high-level Washington spy groups during the Eisenhower administration.
Okay.
All right. So most of the stuff you've heard about the CIC is just, that was the cover story. I saw a document that said they figured that Congress would go easier on the Army in case anything were ever found out about the Nazi recruitment.
Fascinating. I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah. No, the guys in the Army Counterintelligence Corps, quite frankly, were among the very best. Don't forget, 99% of the people in CIA and Army counterintelligence are real decent Americans, believe in the Bill of Rights. The problems were with the political appointees, the guys like Allen Dulles and Casey that were in it for the money.
We'll be getting to some of those appointments and the people who were in the money in the next segment of our interview. I'm speaking with John Loftus along with Mark Ahrens, the author of The Secret War Against the Jews, subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People, a hardcover edition of St. Martin's Press, 1994. John, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to continue with our interview. Once again, it is my pleasure to be visiting with John Loftus along with Mark Ahrens, the author of The Secret War Against the Jews, subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People, published in 1994 by the St. Martin's Press in hardcover. John, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
No, thank you.
We were speaking before our break about the machinations of the petroleum industry as it relates to the world of espionage and intelligence, and we were also speaking about the resultant duplicity in American policy toward Israel. As someone who's lived in California since the late 1970s, I have very vivid memories of the great distress that was experienced by the residents of the Golden State during the, quote, oil shortage, unquote, of the 1970s, specifically 1979. One of the most remarkable aspects of your book, one of many remarkable aspects of your book, is a discussion of that, quote, oil shortage, unquote. And, well, perhaps you'd like to explain why I'm putting that in quotes.
Well, there was no oil shortage. It was a fraud. The oil industry and CIA's oil analysts had, by the time of the Carter administration, a really interlocking relationship. And the long and short of it was that the new president, as he was coming in, received these dire warnings from CIA that there was going to be a major oil shortage. The Saudis were running out of oil. The Russians were going to run out of oil. They were going to invade the Middle East. And we had to start arming the Arabs. And Carter believed it. But to the surprise of the oil companies, his answer was oil conservation, which infuriated them. But anyway, the whole scam was intended to make sure that Carter was a one-term president. As soon as Reagan came into office, all of a sudden the CIA miraculously reversed their dramatic doomsday predictions that oil was running out, and the world was awash in oil. There was actually an oil surplus.
This oil shortage, again, actually was designed, in part at least, to destabilize Jimmy Carter and to make him unpopular as a president.
Oh, very much so.
And boy, it sure worked in California, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
That was an epicenter of anti-Carter sentiment. That scam had a number of implications, many of which are not only with us today, but I'm afraid, John, are likely to be bedeviling not only the American people, but in light of America's position in the world financial and industrial community, the whole world, for quite some time to come. The Arabs, in particular Saudi Arabia, was armed by the United States and specifically given AWACS as a result of this.
We changed the balance of power in the Middle East. Israel was no longer America's largest aircraft carrier. All of a sudden, we armed the Arabs to the teeth.
One of the things that also resulted from this deliberate deception on the part of the petroleum industry and its field level operatives within the intelligence community, and again, I think one of the many very important points of your book is that it illustrates in dramatic and conclusive fashion the connections between the operations of the intelligence community and the powerful forces of industry and finance at whose behest.
It's not quite a conspiracy. The guys, the analysts in the CIA, were largely duped. What happened is that their retired colleagues working for the oil companies fed them false information. Mm-hmm. The oil companies, quite frankly, are a perfect cover for collecting intelligence in the Middle East. And they're also a perfect vehicle for distorting intelligence. So they literally jimmied all of the oil production forecasts coming back to CIA, and the analysts reported what they thought were the true facts. They had no idea that their old retired colleagues in the oil companies had conned them.
One of the results of this con was the enormous military buildup under Ronald Reagan as we make the transition now from the Carter administration to the first Reagan administration. There was, of course, an enormous military buildup.
The phony oil shortage and the future war in the Middle East, that was the justification for borrowing more money than all American presidents combined.
Which, of course, tripled the national debt by the time Ronald Reagan left office, having campaigned under a banner of fiscal responsibility, a situation George Bush compounded. Now, one of the things that you and Mr. Ahrens talk about in your book, and that is, on the one hand, the profound role of the Bechtel Corporation in the Reagan administration, and also the Bechtel Corporation's deeply anti-Semitic outlook as a result of their operations in the Middle East.
Yeah. Bechtel was one of the corporations that was found to be guilty of adhering to the Arab embargo against sales to Israel. Bechtel has been in the Middle East for a long time. They're in bed with the Arabs. They are entirely pro-Arab. The only Bechtel guy to emerge from this whole thing with some honor was Secretary of State George Shultz, who got so fed up with all the broken promises from the Arab states that he actually had somewhat of a pro-Israeli stance, which accounts in many people's mind for why he was, asked to resign pretty promptly. The irony is when Shultz got back to Bechtel, he discovered that Bechtel was constructing a dual-use chemical plant, and it could be used to manufacture the precursors for poison gas, the original Nazi formula. Mm-hmm. Shultz ordered the plant halted, okay? And it would have been irony if Bechtel had finished a poison gas plant for Saddam Hussein just before the Gulf War. Now, there's an interesting tie-in with Jonathan Pollard here, because Pollard had warned the Israelis that the West Germans were building the plants, and Pollard may not have realized that he blew the whistle on his own boss, Kapp Weinberger, who was also Bechtel. Now, I haven't seen any documents indicating that Weinberger had direct knowledge of the poison gas plant contract. And I think quite unlikely that he did know about it, or he would have not taken such a high profile in the Jonathan Pollard case. But Pollard is the classic example of a guy who, admittedly committed a crime and should deserve to spend 3 years in prison, was sentenced to 40 years because he'd stumbled on something much more important. He had stumbled on a major political scandal.
The Pollard spy case and its relationship to some of the things that Mr. Pollard probably did not understand the significance of brings us to a discussion of some of the intelligence-related scandals in the 1980s. Of course, George Bush was former director of Central Intelligence and an individual whose genesis goes back to many of the things that we've already discussed. His genesis as a political creature, actually his genesis as a physical creature going back to his Nazi collaborating progenitors. But the overlapping scandals of the Iran-Contra scandal, the Iraqgate/BNL scandal, and many of the other intelligence-related scandals of the 1980s, the BCCI scandal, have as one of their focal points something that I've focused on in my research and something that is dealt with, I think, in detailed and very clear fashion by you and your co-author, and that is what you and Mr. Ahrens refer to as a private intelligence agency run by George Bush. This grew out of the Vice President's Task Force on Combating Terrorism and the recommendations coming out of it. You refer to that alternately as the Special Situations Group and a Pre-Crisis Planning Group.
Yeah, that was the subcommittee for the Special Situations Group. We have top-secret White House documents. We got declassified showing that in 1982, Vice President George Bush was put in charge of his own little spy agency, and that Oliver North was the officer assigned to detail the work of the committee. And they had a lot of cockamamie ideas. In the Middle East, their idea was to recruit an indigenous force of Lebanese that could be used to run around and kidnap Arab terrorists. Well, actually, it was a thinly disguised assassination program. And when the paperwork was drawn up and submitted to Bush and then went over to CIA, the CIA went wild. And, they were calling Oliver North up in the middle of the night saying, this is crazy. Whoever heard of such a program? And the idea was officially shelved. Well, what happened is that unofficially it went forward. There was a guy from U.S. Special Forces, Bill Buckley, who was a friend of Casey's over at CIA. And
not to be confused, by the way, with the famous columnist also with the CIA.
No, not that.
Right.
This is another Bill Buckley.
Sure.
And he was sent to Lebanon to organize the kidnap teams. And Buckley himself got kidnapped, and that caused a big uproar. Because if Buckley was tortured, he could really spill the beans about George Bush. Back when Bush was CIA director, he had used Buckley and a British agent to evade the congressional arms ban on arms to Angola. And now, when Buckley was kidnapped, Bush went to the British and said, hey, can we send arms to Iran? Well, within 2 weeks of Buckley being kidnapped, the British agent was putting together an arms deal. And the ship was supposed to depart Greece and go to Iran. Now, at the same time, Jonathan Pollard is this lowly clerk working at Naval Intelligence. And he stumbles across this pattern of PLO arms shipments coming out of Greece, going to Yemen. So in April, he tips off the Israelis. Watch the Greek shipments. The Israelis confirm it. They tell the Greek government. In May, the Greek government raids a ship full of arms. Well, Pollard didn't realize it, but he had just raided George Bush's first arms shipment to Iran.
And again, the genesis of the Iran-Contra scandal did not come with the Israelis or even
this is
CIA.
a year before the Israelis were ever involved.
But it came from George Bush as the main operative and as a vehicle, the private intelligence agency that he was running out of the SSG CPPG.
Yep. And the irony is that there was a major scandal. First of all, it was totally illegal. And second of all, the Syrian middleman they had contracted to buy the weapons and ship them to Iran turns out to have been a terrorist. Now, I know this sounds bizarre, but Oliver North actually hired a Syrian terrorist and put him on the White House payroll.
This, by the way, is a name that is very well known to my listeners. A fellow, again, who would appear obscure to most people, but a fellow named Manzar al-Qassar, who is identified in your book and dealt with extensively as the principal operative in the Iran-Contra arms transfers.
Yep. Manzar al-Qassar was the guy who bought the communist weapons for the Contras, and he was also the guy that did the major hostage negotiations. The Israelis were brought in a year later as scapegoats. They were only allowed to ship low-level stuff, some obsolete tow missiles and spare parts for Hawk missiles, things like that. The new high-tech stuff was all going through Manzar. and the Syrians to Iran. But what we didn't realize was that Monzer was a real terrorist. I mean, there's a congressional report saying that Monzer's syndicate's responsible for 20% of the heroin that reaches the United States. Interpol had an entire conference on Monzer. He helped blow up the Paris synagogue. His crew helped hijack the Achille Lauro, all sorts of wonderful things.
By the way, he was recently acquitted of piracy in Spain on those charges.
Yeah, well, that was not surprising. One witness against him fell out a window, and the other witness had his children kidnapped, and all the American DEA evidence was excluded.
A fascinating bit of a quote.
So here's the joke. Jonathan Pollard is the guy that inadvertently threatened to ruin Bush's run for the presidency by exposing this arms shipment. He's in jail, and the real villain, Monzer Alcazar, walks around free. Pollard knew too little. Monzer knew too much.
And Monzer Alcazar was not only a major terrorist, but, as you pointed out, a major drug dealer.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
One of the elements that figures centrally in the Iran-Contra scandal, and it's something that you deal with at great length in the latter part of your book, is the BCCI, also the focus of an unfortunately attenuated investigation here in the United States.
No, it was just too embarrassing. It's the BCCI, the joke is it stands for the British cover for collecting intelligence. The British came up with the idea of setting up a phony Arab bank so they could trace terrorist money. And it was a real good idea, especially because the British were employing Monzer to lure all the other Arab terrorists to put their money in the bank. So that's why there were no terrorist attacks in Britain and the United States. We had them all wiretapped. Of course, we weren't telling Israel, but that was too bad for them. Unfortunately, the British put a bunch of Pakistani crooks in charge of the day-to-day operation of the bank and ended up costing innocent people around the world some $20 billion in losses. But we just walked away from it.
And that BCCI was actually a British intelligence operation.
Sure. Well, partly. The British had the London end of the bank wiretap, but they needed to get a big wiretap station in the Gulf states. So that was when George Bush, as head of CIA, took a $400 million allocation, and we built a listening post down there precisely for that purpose.
One of the things that you discuss in your book is that as the CIA was forming liaisons with the Palestine Liberation Organization, terrorist attacks against Americans were halted, but that it was deemed okay, or at least tolerable, to permit PLO and other Middle East terrorist groups to continue to commit attacks against Jews.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's one of the things that outraged Pollard. He's sitting there and he's reading intelligence reports. We knew in advance of which PLO people would be coming across the borders from Lebanon and attacking which village.
Something that I have focused on in my program is the conflicts that were occurring as George Bush gave way ultimately to Bill Clinton between elements of military intelligence and elements of the civilian intelligence agencies. I'd like to read just a few sentences from page 485 of your book, again bearing in mind the position of Monzer al-Qassar and BCCI in the Iran-Contra scandal. And by the way, we should also perhaps mention that the use of British intelligence by George Bush and company, and there's a pun there, as a back channel, and it was British intelligence that was centrally involved in Iran-Contra, dates all the way back to the Angola operation that you mentioned.
Precisely.
A military intelligence group called the Intelligence Support Activity is discussed by you and Mr. Ahrens, and you write on page 485 and 6, one group almost blew the whistle on Bush, the members of the Intelligence Support Activity, or ISA. This top-secret American commando group had been sent to Lebanon to rescue the hostages by force. The ISA got lucky and developed a network of Lebanese informants that uncovered the hostages' whereabouts. By November of 1986, the commandos had gathered all the intelligence, maps of the various Iranian compounds, and even the names of the Syrian officers who shuttled the captives back and forth. One Pentagon source showed us the documents with details down to the license plate numbers. The commandos had a positive identification of all 6 surviving hostages. They were ready to rescue them when suddenly they were told to stop collecting intelligence and come home. In the end, the truth was too embarrassing. The problem with the ISA team was that it was too good. It was flooding U.S. intelligence channels with highly accurate reports on Monzer al-Qassar, General Canaan, and the Syrian drug runners who controlled the kidnappers. The Army had no idea that al-Qassar was working for the White House on hostage ransom. The ISA's sin was success. It had dug up too much of the truth. That's a fascinating example of something that you deal with at great length throughout your book, which is intelligence agencies and national security agencies getting their wires crossed.
Oh, yeah. One old spy said to think of American intelligence in terms of the African centipede theory. The African centipede has 50 sets of opposing male and female sex organs, and it sits around all day having intercourse with itself.
I'm glad you amended that for air.
Yeah, it was a little more colorful than the original.
Okay. One of the things that I've wondered, and I'd like to perhaps skip down to the bottom of page 486, where, again, you write, we regret to confirm that Youssef Haidar, now he was a Syrian intelligence operative also in contact with the Soviets, wasn't he not?
He's the man who actually tortured Bill Buckley to death.
Right, well, as the sentence goes on, we regret to confirm that Youssef Haidar, the man who tortured Buckley to death, was subsequently observed in Washington, D.C. with a VIP escort by Agent John Lipka, L-I-P-K-A, of the FBI. Shortly after Haidar's visit, Bush announced to the press that the Syrians had gotten a, quote, bad rap, unquote, for terrorism. Shortly thereafter, several more hostages were released. Shortly after that, the CIA was told to stop investigating a Syrian connection to the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, and focus attention on Libya. One of the questions I have, and I don't know if you're in a position to answer this directly, but I've wondered about that report, the Interfor report.
Oh, no, it's a complete bungle. He had snippets, bits and pieces of information, but by and large, just a waste of time.
Okay, so in other words, you agree with the contention that was a bad report?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I think that the bottom line is that Mansour al-Qazar was playing on both sides of the fence. The Iranians had contracted with Syrian intelligence to carry out a series of attacks. The Iranians gave the money to the Syrians. Mansour's group in Germany, the PFLP-GC, was supposed to carry out the bomb attacks, but they got raided by the West German police, and identical bombs were seized. Mansour then subcontracted the hit of the Lockerbie plane to Libyan intelligence.
So
at the same time, Mansour betrayed the Libyan plans to the British. Okay, that's how we knew to pull our American diplomats off the plane. Okay?
So in other words, you do not agree with the Interfor report, but you do feel that Mansour al-Qazar was centrally involved in the bombing?
Well, just in terms of after the original plans went awry in Germany, he just subcontracted the job out.
One of the things I've wondered about, too, is the group of U.S. military intelligence operatives that died on that plane, the McKee team, they're termed. Is there any connection between them and the ISA group that you alluded to earlier?
I'm not at liberty to comment on anybody's membership in a particular agency, but I think that was simply an unfortunate coincidence. I have found no evidence to confirm that was a direct hit. The information that Mansour passed on to Western intelligence was just that one of the Pan Am planes would be hit. Didn't say which one.
Okay, well, again, I didn't want to put you on the spot. I realize the sensitivity of your position. Moving on to another of the intelligence-related scandals that emerged onto the public scene in the late 1980s and 90s, the Iraqgate or BNL scandal. Now, you and your co-author mention that too had its genesis with the private intelligence agency run by oil man George Bush.
Yeah, I think George Bush is a nice guy who does favors for his friends, and unfortunately, his big mistake was trusting people like Casey. Bush, I don't think, is an anti-Semite. I mean, when I went through his private files at the Skull and Bones Club at Yale, I found out, for example, that George Bush voted to admit Jews and blacks to Yale. But the idea of a private spy organization was somehow appealing. And he'd been a former head of CIA, but didn't really know all that much. And Casey was saying this is a good idea. And the CIA was dragging its feet. They didn't want to get involved in a lot of illegal covert operations, didn't want to arrive the bad old days of Watergate and things like that. And so they went ahead and put their little private spy shop together. The irony is that one of Bush's friends, Tom Clancy, has written a novel about this called Op Center, in which the hero is Gregory Donald, who is thinly disguised as Don Gregg. That was Bush's CIA assistant, and later in the White House, Vice President Bush's deputy, who was in charge of this little spy shop.
One of the chapters one of the last chapters deals with some of the machinations that underlay the Persian Gulf War. Specifically on page 488, you write in a chapter called The Victors and the Victims, the old spies have a very interesting explanation for Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. American oil companies told him it was all right to invade, so he did. The oil companies were the only ones who agreed that Iraq had a legitimate gripe against Kuwait. Then you go on to say, the tip of a banana-shaped oil field in southern Iraq extends 3 miles across the Kuwaiti border, and then you go on to indicate that curious aspect of the oil fields figured into the Persian Gulf War. Could you develop for us?
The Kuwaitis were pumping their tip of the oil field dry and not paying any compensation to the Iraqis, as was supposed to be done under international oil agreements. And Saddam Hussein was furious. Also, and at the same time, the Iraqis were billing him $10 billion for the money they loaned him during the war with Iran. And the American oil advisors on the scene said, "Oh, this is terrible what the Kuwaitis are doing, and no one would really mind if he went and took that corner of the oil field. Well, if he gives Saddam 3 miles, he's going to take the whole country." And he went in. He never figured the Americans would object. After all, he was selling the oil to us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we started this, the relationship with Iraq, they were selling like a tiny amount, 50,000 barrels a day, and it later grew to like 1.8 million barrels a day. I mean, we were his best customer. We had a special spy base in Iraq. We were giving them satellite photography to help with the war in Iran, training their soldiers, directing their military strategy. And, you know, we were the guys that saved Saddam Hussein from defeat in the war with Iran. So Saddam Hussein had every reason to believe that what these oil companies were telling him was, in fact, official Washington policy.
So, in other words, he was basically lured in by the petroleum agency, by the petroleum companies.
Yeah. Well, it's a confusion on both sides. But that's what happens when you try and have foreign policy run by a bunch of private companies.
And, of course, ultimately, the United States wound up fighting and, unfortunately, not losing too many men against the armed forces of Saddam Hussein, which were armed to a large extent out of some of these machinations.
Yep.
John, by way of concluding this interview, I would like to perhaps take a look to the future as we speak on June 2nd of 1995. There is a great deal of attention and also angst about the possibility of U.S. ground troops being involved in the Bosnian War, although certainly the excesses of the Serbs in that conflict are not to be overlooked or dismissed in any way or exonerated. In fact, the genesis of this tragic conflict, one which may involve U.S. troops, could even conceivably expand to a larger war, in many ways goes back to some of the elements that we've already spoken about in connection with the fascist freedom fighters and also the Republican Ethnic Outreach Council. The Croatian fascists, the Ustashi, figure prominently in some of the things that you and Mr. Ahrens discuss, and in fact, the genesis of the tragedy now unfolding in the former Yugoslavia came when Germany, which has long been very close to the Ustashi elements, and the United States and the rest of the EC, Germany and the rest of the EC and the United States recognized the secession of Croatia and I believe it was Montenegro from the former Yugoslavian Republic.
Yep. It's the old cycle of our failure to pursue Nuremberg and pursue the Nazi war criminals has, or in the last 50 years, come back to haunt us. The end of World War II, countries like Croatia were snap frozen. They went from fascism to communism. They had no experience in democracy. And now the old fascist symbols and aspirations have just, come back to full life with the full support of Germany and a few other countries, in fact. I think that we've got two choices. We can either do what we did in the Holocaust and pretend that it isn't happening, or we can all go in, as we did in the Middle East, and put the fire out quickly before it spreads. I don't think there's any middle option.
Mm-hmm. By the way, it was Slovenia, or not Montenegro, but Slovenia, as I think back on it. It's interesting, though, that the match to that particular tinderbox was applied by the secession of Croatia, and to a considerable extent, Franjo Tudjman and the government there has recapitulated some of the more odious aspects of the Ustashi regime. And
openly adopted some Ustashi symbols and revered some of the Ustashi leaders. It's really sad. It's pathetic.
And in fact, to a certain extent at least, the tragedy in the former Yugoslavia represents a continuation of the bloodletting of World War II. It was sort of held in suspended animation. The Serbs were dealt with very harshly by the Croatians, and now, in a sense, they're effecting their revenge.
I found it interesting that the leaders of the American Jewish community are very, very supportive of the Muslims in Bosnia, because I think they recognize parallels to the Holocaust. During World War II, the American public didn't know then what was going on, but our intelligence community did. I was reading accurate weekly reports the number of Jews being killed as early as September 1941. We closed our eyes and turned away.
One of the things that's interesting, too, is you discuss some of the reports reaching, among others, former Supreme Court Justice Brandeis. And he said, in response to an account of what was going on at Auschwitz, he said, "I know you believe what you're saying, but I cannot accept it as true," or words to that effect.
Yeah. Well, that's because he was speaking to one Jewish survivor. What Justice Frankfurter didn't know was that the British Secret Service, the Polish Underground, the Vatican were all feeding U.S. intelligence with the full breadth and width of the Holocaust. And the British government and the American government were lying to the press about it. We're saying we could not confirm it when we knew it was going on. Last year, the British press reported that they've started to declassify some of the German codes that Churchill was reading. The first codes that the Germans broke were for the mobile killing units of the Nazi troops on the Eastern Front. Mm-hmm. We knew it all.
And anti-Semitism is something that is by no means, as we've seen, alien to the United States. We're almost out of time, John, but in the wake of Oklahoma City and once again discussion of alleged Jewish conspiracies, the revival of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, how do you feel the lessons of your book relates to what is going on in that regard today?
You know, I'm just an Irish Catholic, but I warned some of the Jewish groups 12 years ago that anti-Semitism is cyclical in America, and it's coming back in a big way. People want to look for scapegoats. And the Jews are easy. They're the tiniest ethnic minority in America. They're easy to push around. There's a long history of doing that.
John, I would like to, in conclusion, extend my thanks to you and Mark Ahrens, and also, and this might seem a little corny or pretentious, I would also like to extend my thanks and also perhaps the thanks of the American people and all of humanity to the old spies. If they never get a direct thank you anyplace else, please extend my thank you, and I suspect on behalf, I'm safe in thanking them on behalf of the American people and the human race.
I think it's very important and very appropriate. These people wanted to let the truth be known before they died. 30, 40 years from now, the rest of the records will be declassified, and my children and grandchildren will know that I had spoke and interviewed the men who wrote those documents. It's an important part of history. It's an ugly part of history, and we should face up to it.
As Adlai Stevenson once said, a lie is an abomination unto the Lord and a present comfort in difficult situations. I think you and your co-author have done much to clear up the lies of history. Once again, we've been visiting with John Loftus along with Mark Ahrens, the author of The Secret War Against the Jews, subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People, St. Martin's Press, hardcover, 1994. John Loftus, thanks so much for visiting with us.
Thank you, Dave.